Hey there. Tonight, we're going to step back in time. Not to watch battles, not to follow warriors, but to slip into the quiet corridors behind the armor. Into a life that was rarely written down. This is not a tale of swords and glory. This is the story of a woman, a wife, bound not just by marriage, but by silence. Tonight we'll explore what it meant to be the wife of a samurai, not in legend, but in the shadows of real history. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin.
You were 13 when they told you his name. You didn't speak it. Not then. Not even when your mother pressed the wedding robe into your arms, a silken thing, stiff with embroidery, stinking faintly of the lacquered chest it had been sealed in for years. You didn't cry. Samurai wives didn't cry. They bowed, they obeyed, they became. The wedding was not a ceremony for you, it was a transaction. He stood beneath the red gate with armor that had never touched war, surrounded by men who smiled too easily. You stood behind a screen of paper and wood, waiting to be summoned. When the screen slid open, the world changed. You were no longer your father's daughter. You were his property now. His name was Hirotaka. You would not speak it for many weeks. In the home, his home, you moved like smoke, your steps silent, your eyes lowered. You learned the scent of his arrival before the doors even opened, the rattle of sandal against stone, the click of his sword stand as he placed the blade just so. He rarely looked at you. That was normal. Affection, you had been told, was the behavior of peasants and drunks. A proper wife tended to the tea, to the stitching, to the temple offerings. She prepared ink and scrolls. She read the Confucian texts out loud to no one. And she waited for his moods, his silences, his rituals. You kept the house ready for guests, ready for war, ready for death. Because being a samurai's wife meant being invisible, until suddenly you weren't. And when that moment came, you had better not fail.
You learned not to flinch when he entered the room. That was the first lesson. When Hirotaka stepped through the threshold, mud scraped from his sandals, rain glistening off the sleeves of his kimono, you bowed exactly low enough, exactly long enough. Never first to speak, never last to leave. The sword came with him. Always. Even when he removed it and placed it across the sword rack in the tokonoma alcove, it remained, as if the steel itself watched you, judged you. There was a word for it, kataki, the enemy, but it didn't mean what it did on the battlefield. Inside these walls, silence was the enemy. Silence held the weight of all the things you were forbidden to say. You watched the women in the neighborhood, older wives, their faces powdered white, eyes dull from decades of looking down. Some of them smiled when they passed you, others simply bowed as though too tired to pretend they remembered their own names. One of them, Lady Aiko, whispered to you once during a festival, "Do not let the house swallow you whole." You didn't know what she meant at the time, but you would. Because the house was more than wood and rice paper. It was a trap designed by generations, and it held rules that could not be spoken aloud. You rose before dawn. You cleaned the ashes from the fire pit before your husband ever stirred. You boiled rice without letting the pot hiss. You prepared his inkstone, poured his tea, arranged his writing brush and paper with surgical care. If he saw you, really saw you, it was either a sign of failure or a sign of disaster. Sometimes when he was gone training or summoned to the daimyo's court, you would breathe again, just for an afternoon. You'd walk through the garden barefoot, stepping between stones, letting the chill of moss and mud remind you were alive. But even then, the sword remained, on the rack, in your mind. Because the duty of the samurai wife was not just to serve, it was to die if honor demanded it. Your life was tied to his, not just in love or name, but by steel. If he fell in battle, you would be expected to follow. If he lost his honor, your blade would find your throat before shame found your family. You were not afraid of death. You were afraid of dying without ever having lived.
You became a master of vanishing. Not in body, you were always there, kneeling beside the hearth, adjusting the ink brush just so, bowing at the correct angle as your husband passed. But in spirit, in presence. You learned to hold your breath when his footsteps grew too slow. You learned to listen between silences, to measure how long it took for him to put down his sword, and whether the thud against the rack was softer or sharper than yesterday. That's how you knew his mood. The sword always spoke first. Hirotaka rarely raised his voice, but the few times he did, it wasn't shouting, it was cutting. Quiet words with edge sharper than any blade. He never struck you, but he didn't need to. A samurai's disapproval could do more damage than any bruise. You were not afraid of pain. You were afraid of shame. There was no court to plead your case, no mother to run to. You had been trained to endure. The senior women in the family were the real enforcers of your place. Lady Ume, his aunt, visited often. She inspected your posture, your calligraphy, the neatness of your stitching, the shine of your rice bowls. When she found fault, she didn't correct you with her voice. She simply paused, raised an eyebrow, and that was worse than yelling. You wrote poetry in your mind, never aloud. You practiced calligraphy in secret, sketching characters in spilled tea before it dried. You even carved a small space in the garden behind the plum tree where you buried your thoughts. Scraps of paper, folded tiny, prayers, dreams, questions, all hidden in the dirt. You once asked the temple priest if a woman could become a ghost if she died with too many words left unsaid. He only smiled. You would not be alone. Sometimes at night, when Hirotaka was gone, you would leave the lamp lit longer than necessary. You'd watch the shadows play on the wall, and for a while you let yourself imagine you were someone else, a girl in a story, a voice no longer afraid of being heard. But when the candle guttered low, you always folded your hands, closed your eyes, and reminded yourself of your place. Because in a samurai's house, even dreams required permission. Rumors moved like incense smoke, slow, curling, clinging to corners no broom could reach. You didn't seek them out. They came to you. Whispers carried by servant girls rinsing rice at the well. Half-finished sentences traded beneath the clatter of bowls in the kitchen. Warnings spoken in riddles between visits from Lady Ume. One word kept surfacing. Kagemi. A name? A woman? A threat? You didn't dare ask, but you listened. It was said Kagemi had once served in a household like yours, quiet and invisible like all samurai wives, until she vanished. Not died, vanished. No funeral rites, no scent of incense in the family altar room, no grieving husband, just an empty futon and a folded robe. Some claimed she had shamed herself. Others said she had simply walked away and became something else. A fox spirit, a demon, a ghost. None of it made sense. Wives didn't disappear. They endured. Until they were buried, nameless and folded into the family shrine. And yet, part of you longed to believe it was true, that there was a way out, a place beyond the paper screens and lacquered trays. That night, when Hirotaka returned from the castle, you saw something in his eyes you hadn't seen before. Fear. He said little at dinner, ate half his rice, then retired to the inner room and closed the doors without his usual nod. You watched the flickering shadow of him behind the screen. Still, tense, holding something. Not a sword. A letter. You weren't meant to see it, but you did. A brushstroke too familiar, the signature too soft, too fluid for a man's hand. Kagemi. You didn't sleep that night. Instead, you crept into the garden and dug up the folded slips of paper you had buried long ago. The ink had bled. The words were fading. But you remembered what they said. When will I become more than his silence? If I vanished, would anyone look for me? Is endurance the same as honor? At dawn, you rose early and dressed in your finest robe. You swept the walkway, boiled the tea, smiled as if nothing stirred beneath the silk. Because if Kagemi was real, so was the choice she made. And somewhere in the folds of the house, between duty and ghost story, a path had opened.
That morning passed like many others, on the surface. You scrubbed the steps until your knuckles ached. You trimmed the garden's edge with shears that had dulled from years of cutting without thanks. You bowed when the merchant delivered the rice, and counted the grains with a quiet precision that belied the tremor in your hand. But everything felt too still, too balanced, like a tray just before it tips. Hirotaka hadn't spoken to you since the letter, and yet the letter was gone. Not burned, there were no ashes, not folded in his scroll box. He never kept personal things near sacred texts. It had vanished, like her. That evening he sat near the hearth again, drinking his tea more slowly than usual. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, tracing the fine line between youth and exhaustion. Then he spoke. "Do you know what loyalty means?" You did not answer, because there was no right answer, only traps. He sipped the tea, swallowed. His gaze did not move from the flames. "It means staying," he said finally, "even when you know the world outside that door is hungrier than the one within." He looked at you then, not with love, not even with recognition, but with the hollow weight of expectation, as if daring you to run, as if daring you not to. You bowed. Deep, slow, with perfect form, but inside your mind was already somewhere else. You had heard the gardener's boy talk of the northern pass, a path through the cedar trees, barely wide enough for a cart. Travelers spoke of a shrine hidden beyond the ridge. Women, it was said, sometimes went there when the world no longer made space for their names. They left offerings, they left hair, they left behind who they were. You had nothing to offer, no coin, no gift of carved ivory or fine silk, but you had your breath and your memory, and the map you'd drawn in your mind 100 times, tracing every stone between the back garden and the outer gate. That night you didn't light the lantern. You moved by memory, wrapping yourself in a cloak too thin for the season, carrying only a single comb, your mother's, tucked into your sleeve like a secret. You passed the sword stand without pausing. You slid open the gate without sound, and then you ran into the forest, into the night. Not like Kagemi, not like a ghost, but like someone becoming real again, one step at a time.
The forest didn't welcome you. It didn't resist you either. It simply was, cold, unblinking, indifferent. Your sandals were soaked within the first hour. Your fingers turned stiff, not from fear, but from the deep, creeping chill of early autumn. A crow followed you for a time, hopping from branch to branch. Then it lost interest. Even omens grew tired of wandering wives. Still, you pressed forward. The northern pass was real. You'd heard the rhythm of it in the gossip of kitchen hands, caught the mention of it in the priest's hesitant stories when he thought you weren't listening. "Women disappear there," he had said once, voice hushed. Not as a warning, but as a confession. By the time you reached the cedar trees, the sky had bruised into ink. The wind had teeth. Every sound felt exaggerated. The snap of a twig, the rustle of a fox's paws in underbrush. But the shrine came into view exactly as you'd imagined it, hunched beneath moss-covered stone, with a crooked Torii gate leaning like a drunk against time. No worshippers, no offerings, only the scent of old smoke and the faint shimmer of candle wax from gods long gone. You approached carefully. Your heartbeat wasn't racing. It was slow, measured, like something had already decided. Inside the shrine was smaller than you expected, just a narrow wooden platform, dust gathering in corners,
a small altar with paper charms fluttering faintly in the wind. You knelt, not to pray, to ask. You didn't say the words aloud. You didn't need to. Every ache in your shoulders, every silence you had swallowed, every look you had endured, they rose in your throat like smoke, wordless and heavy. The shrine didn't answer, but it didn't reject you either. It let you stay. You took out the comb from your sleeve, mother of pearl, chipped at the edge, and placed it on the altar. You thought of your mother's hands braiding your hair, of your own reflection when you still remembered how to smile. You whispered one word, not a plea, a name. Your name. Not the one Hirotaka used, not the titles spoken through folded screens and duty, your true name, spoken so slothly it might have been mistaken for wind. And for the first time in years, you felt the air change. Not warmer, not safer, but yours. The shrine did not speak, but something in the stillness began to shift. You slept beneath the torii gate that night, curled like a question mark, your back against cold stone and your dreams broken into fragments. You dreamed of plum blossoms blooming in winter, of Lady Ume watching from behind a screen, her lips moving but making no sound, of Hirotaka kneeling in the empty house, holding your comb like a blade. When you awoke, the wind was stronger, not wild, but purposeful, as if it had made up its mind about you. The forest no longer felt unfamiliar. The rustle of leaves overhead wasn't menacing anymore. It was a kind of conversation, one you could finally understand. You sat up slowly, rubbed your hands together, and took in the silence around you. Not a silence of absence, but one of permission. You were still hungry. Your knees ached. But something had changed. You hadn't been followed. Not by Hirotaka. Not by the women who measured your life in stitches and silence. You had disappeared just as Kagumi had. And perhaps that's what the shrine offered. Not salvation, but erasure. A way to step sideways out of the world that had never asked what you wanted. There were footsteps in the dirt behind the shrine. Faint, not fresh. Someone had been here before. Maybe many. You followed the path, weaving through the cedar trees, and found what looked like an old shelter. Its roof mostly rotted, walls sagging like tired shoulders. Inside there were signs of life. A cooking pot blackened by fire. A thin blanket, folded carefully. A set of sandals that did not match your own. You weren't alone. Not now. Not ever. Later, at dusk, as the wind threaded through the branches above, you sat beside a newly lit fire and thought of the other women, the ones who left their names behind, the ones who chose a shadowed freedom over a silken prison. They weren't ghosts. They were survivors. And slowly, the stories you had once buried, under plum trees and silent tears, began to stitch themselves together again. Not for anyone else, for you. There was a rhythm to life in the woods, But it did not announce itself. It was quiet, like your footsteps when you walked through Hirotaka's hallways. But unlike his house, this rhythm wasn't imposed. It waited for you to join. Your hands learned again how to split kindling, how to boil rice without scorching the bottom, how to pull water from the stream just before sunrise, when the mist still clung to the surface like breath. You spoke to no one for days, until someone spoke to you. She stepped out from between the trees with no ceremony, no bow, no mask of politeness. Her robe was patched and sun-faded, her hair roughly tied with strips of cloth. She looked at you for a long moment, then nodded, as if your presence answered a question she hadn't asked aloud. "Kiri," she said. You understood. A name. Not one given by a husband, not one pressed onto birth scrolls by fathers or priests. A name chosen. You bowed slightly and gave yours, not the one they used in the house, but the one you whispered to the shrine, the one you thought you'd forgotten. She smiled. The next day she brought food, half a dried fish wrapped in leaves. She showed you which plants wouldn't poison your stomach, which roots could be boiled for tea. She didn't talk about where she came from. You didn't ask. It was enough to share silence with someone who had once also escaped. There were others. You found their traces. Bits of old fabric knotted around tree trunks, simple talismans carved into bark. A cup set on a stone, filled with rainwater, an offering, or perhaps a reminder. You are not alone. And yet, you never felt part of a group. This wasn't a sisterhood. It was something older, quieter. A scattered constellation of women who had slipped through the cracks, who had stopped waiting to be saved. Each evening you returned to the shrine and lit a small fire near the edge. You never spoke. You didn't pray. But once in the wind, you heard something. Not a voice, a breath. And it felt like permission. You were no longer anyone's wife. You were something else now. Not a ghost, not a legend. A woman whose name belonged only to her. It took nearly a month before you could sleep through the night. Not because of the cold or the forest sounds, but because part of you still expected Hirotaka's footsteps outside the shelter. A shadow behind the trees. A command barked through clenched teeth. Come back. But he never came. And in that silence, your mind began to uncoil. You started to remember the things you'd buried beneath obedience. The weight of your mother's last hug before the marriage. The sharp thrill of climbing trees barefoot as a girl, long before you were told what was proper. The feel of calligraphy ink staining your fingers when you were allowed to practice poetry just once before your father dismissed it as a waste of time. Now your hands were stained with earth and ash and pine sap, and none of it needed permission. You carried no mirror, but you could feel the change. The woman in the woods no longer moved with the stiffness of fear. Her steps had purpose. Her voice, when it spoke to the wind or to Kitty, did not tremble. You had begun to take small risks, wandering farther beyond the stream, planting bitter herbs near the shelter, letting your hair grow wild. One morning, you found a small broken comb washed up beside the rocks. It wasn't yours, not your mother's, but it had once belonged to someone. You picked it up, turned it over in your hands, and placed it beside your fire, a new offering for whoever might come next. Kitty didn't visit often, but when she did, she brought pieces of the outside world. News passed from hidden mouths, a famine near the southern coast, a daimyo who had fallen from grace, a local lord building another estate with new wives and fewer prayers. All of it felt distant now, not unreal, just unnecessary. Your world had narrowed, and somehow it had grown. The other women remained rumors, flickers of movement beyond the trees, a rustle when the wind was still. Once you spotted a bundle of cloth left near the shrine, carefully placed, wrapped around dried mushrooms and rice. A gift, a message, or maybe a kind of pact. You exist. I see you. Some nights you still dreamed of the house, of Hirotaka's silent rage, of Lady Ume's absence. But the dreams no longer ended in fear. They ended with you standing at the edge of the forest, turning away, choosing not to return. You were not a runaway. You were a woman who had learned the oldest truth. Sometimes, freedom isn't granted. It's taken. By the time the first frost crept across the leaves, your shelter had changed. You'd lined the walls with thick rushes, reinforced the roof with pine boughs. The floor, once hard and cold, now rested beneath layers of straw and scavenged fabric. A warmth lived there now, not just of fire or body, but of presence, of decision. You had made something out of nothing, and that something was yours. But peace in the forest was not constant. One morning, before the sun had crested the hills, you heard movement beyond the bamboo grove. Not a fox, not a deer. Heavy, slow, deliberate. You froze. Your hand went instinctively to the small blade you kept by the mat. A cooking knife, but in your hands it felt like more. You didn't breathe, didn't blink. For a moment every leaf seemed to hold still with you. Then came a voice. Low, male, faint. Is this the path? Another answered, gruffer. I don't care. The woman's gone. She can rot with the spirits for all I care. You stayed low, pressed to the earth. They passed. 2 men, perhaps 3, none you recognized. Not Hirotaka, but men who spoke with the same entitlement, with the same disinterest in women's lives, unless those lives served a purpose. Their footsteps moved away slowly, crunching over dead leaves, heading west. When they were gone, you didn't move for a long time. The wind shifted. You stood at last and went straight to the shrine. Someone had disturbed it. The charms had been scattered. Your comb was missing. The ashes from the old fire had been kicked aside, leaving black smudges across the stone. You knelt and carefully began to restore what you could. You didn't cry. You didn't curse. You simply rebuilt. But that night, the dreams returned. Hirotaka, a screen door sliding open, blood in a basin, a hand reaching not to strike, but to pull. You awoke sweating, your breath loud in the tiny room. You stepped outside. The stars blinked coldly above the trees. The forest was quiet again. But you knew now, quiet was not safety. Kitty came 2 days later. She saw the marks near the shrine and narrowed her eyes. "They're looking," she said. You nodded. "They won't find what they want," she added. And you believed her, because you were no longer the woman who flinched at footsteps, no longer the obedient wife they expected to tame or retrieve. You had joined something older than marriage, deeper than law, a lineage not written in scrolls or etched on stone, a sisterhood of vanishing, of surviving, of remaining even when erased. And now the forest didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a home. Winter deepened, slow and certain, like ink soaking into cloth. Snow began to gather at the edge of the forest, light at first, barely more than a dusting, then thicker, more confident. The boughs sagged with its weight. Your breath came in soft clouds. Even the firewood took longer to catch, reluctant in the cold. Inside the hut, the silence grew, not empty, but full, of thought, of breath, of the weight of your own endurance. You no longer counted the days, not since the men passed, not since Kiri left last, taking with her a bundle of roots and leaving behind a coil of red thread. "Wind-binding thread," she said, "for when the cold tries to sneak inside your bones." You used it that night, weaving it through the collar of your robe like a charm, not because you believed entirely, but because it reminded you of touch, of someone's hands unafraid. Your hair grew longer, your hands rougher. The mirror, when you dared uncover it, showed someone older, sharper. Not the girl from the courtyard, not the bride with downcast eyes. Someone else, someone unfinished but true. Then, one evening, the silence changed. It wasn't broken. It shifted. You sat by the hearth, mending the hem of your cloak, when you heard it. Not footsteps, not wind, but humming. Distant, melodic. It wound through the bamboo like smoke, uncertain but deliberate. You stood, blade in hand, and stepped outside. Nothing. Only snow. Only trees. Only you. But the humming remained. You followed it. Not far, only as far as the shrine, where the snow had melted in a perfect circle. Steam rose from the earth, and in the center, a scrap of cloth. Blue silk, frayed at the edges, embroidered with 3 white cranes. You knew it. It had once been the sleeve of your wedding robe, the piece you had torn and burned the night you ran. No footprints, no trace, only the silk, and the feeling, deep in your spine, that someone had watched you dream and answered. You brought the cloth inside, wrapped it in linen,
and placed it in the floor box beside your grandmother's brooch. You didn't speak of it, not even when Kiri returned the next week, red-cheeked from cold, a small jar of honey in her pack. But she saw it in your face. She always did. "Things don't follow us," she said gently, pouring tea. "They wait, until we've stopped running, until we've become quiet enough to listen." You nodded. And that night, you listened. To the fire, to the wind, to the hush between snowflakes as they kissed the roof. And beneath it all, faint but certain, the humming again. This time, from your own throat. A tune you'd never learned, but had always known.
By midwinter, the world outside had shrunk to grays and browns. The bright golds of autumn, the shimmer of rice fields, even the bloom of wild persimmons, all swallowed by a sky that never opened and a forest that slept with one wary eye. Yet inside your shelter, a strange peace had taken root. It wasn't comfort, not in the way your old life had defined it. There was no warmth without work, no safety without vigilance. But there was rhythm, and in rhythm a kind of power. You rose before light, fed the fire, pounded grain, checked the traps, sometimes returning with a rabbit or a quail, sometimes with nothing. You learned to live on less, and then to expect even less than that, not out of fear, but freedom. Your name, your old one, had begun to feel like something worn out, a robe that didn't fit. You weren't her anymore, not the daughter, not the wife, not even the woman who fled. You were what you made with your hands. The shrine had grown too. You added to it slowly, a stone shaped like a crescent, a comb with only 3 teeth, a string of dried berries, offerings not to any god, but to memory itself, not Hirotaka's memory, not the house you'd left. Your own. What you chose to keep. One morning, just after a windstorm, you found a trail of ash leading from the grove's edge to your door. Not footprints, just a soft smear across the snow, like someone had walked barefoot through the remains of a fire. At its end, nothing. No offering, no message, just absence. That night, the dream returned, but it had changed. This time, Hirotaka didn't reach. He knelt. At your feet. His face not angry, not cold, just lost. "You left the world," he said. And in the dream your voice replied, steady, "No, I found mine." You woke with the words still in your mouth, not whispered, spoken, like a spell. And then came the smoke. Not from your fire. It curled through the cracks in your walls, bitter, oily. Wood, yes, but also flesh. Something burning that should not burn. You rushed outside. Orange lit the sky. Far beyond the trees, where the road once wound past your old home, a column of fire rose. You couldn't see it, not clearly, but you knew. The village was gone. Not razed, not raided, consumed. You watched from the edge of the grove, heart tight, not with grief, but with clarity. You had already mourned those ashes. What was left behind no longer held you. When you returned to your shelter, the smoke clung to your robes, not the fire's smoke, your own. The last of your past, lifting, finally, into the sky. You buried the silk crane scrap that night, deep beneath the floor. You whispered nothing over it. It did not deserve ceremony. Then you rebuilt the threshold, stronger this time, not as a door to keep out, but as a mark of your choosing. No one would enter without being seen, and if they did, you were no longer afraid of what you'd do.
Snow melted slowly that year. It clung stubbornly to the roots and hollows, refusing to lift even as birds began to return to the canopy and early buds pierced the frost-bitten soil. Your breath no longer smoked with each exhale, but you still wrapped your shawl tightly in the mornings, out of habit more than need. Kiri hadn't returned since the fire. You told yourself she was safe, that she'd moved deeper into the forest, maybe south where the river bent and the mountain foxes shed their winter coats. You whispered her name to the shrine, placed a curl of wood smoke beside her stone, and waited. But waiting wasn't stillness. You moved with purpose. The traps became snares. You learned which bark could draw out fever and which roots could lull a child to sleep. You carved symbols not just into the shrine, but into the trees surrounding your shelter. Quiet things, protective things. Lines and circles that said, "This place is not forgotten," even if you were. And then, one afternoon, you heard steps. Not stumbling, not hunting. Familiar, measured. You stood in the doorway, hand at your side, not on the blade, just near it. It was a girl, 16 perhaps. Clothes too fine for travel, too new for the forest. But they were torn now, streaked with mud. Her feet were bare, her eyes wide, her hair loose and tangled with twigs. She stared at you like someone who had seen a ghost. You didn't speak. She stepped forward, then fell. You caught her before her head hit the ground. When she woke, she did not speak your language, not fluently, but you understood enough. She had fled a house in the south, a lord's compound. There had been a man promised to her, twice her age, cruel in his silence, worse in his touch. She'd run, and when her feet blistered, she crawled. "I didn't know where I was going," she said. You gave her tea, dressed her cuts, let her rest. She slept for 2 days. On the 3rd, she helped you gather wood. On the 4th, she asked about the carvings. On the 5th, she asked to stay. You didn't answer with words. You handed her a knife, the small one,
the one you once clutched when men walked too near. She took it, understood, and so it began again. But not from the start, from here, from you. She asked for your name, and you gave her the one you had claimed, not the one you had been given. She smiled. It suits you. At the shrine, you made space, not to replace what had been taken, but to mark what had arrived. And as night fell, and 2 fires glowed instead of 1, the forest watched, and perhaps, for the first time, approved.
By midsummer, the girl had a name again. Not her old one, whispered to her once by a nursemaid, shouted by a man with too much wine and too many rules. That name had blistered on her tongue. This one she chose herself. She called herself Sana. And when she said it, her chin lifted. Her eyes did not flinch. She was not strong yet, not in the way the forest demanded. Her hands bled when she carried wood too far. Her wrists trembled when she drew the bow you taught her to string. But each wound became a lesson, each bruise a line in the poem she was learning to write with her life. You didn't coddle her. You didn't ask her to be brave. You showed her the cave where foxes had whelped, the stones that grew moss in circles, the place where Kiri had once sung to the spirits of the trees. You taught her how to be quiet with purpose, how to listen not just for danger, but for change. And then, on the 7th night of the 7th moon, another figure appeared. Not a girl, not a man, a woman, older than both of you, with hair bound tightly in loops and a sash torn at the hem. She didn't speak at first. She only bowed, slow and deep, and laid a single stone at the base of your shrine. There was blood on her sleeve, not fresh, not hers. You led her to the fire, gave her broth, water, the mat beside the wall. She didn't ask for more. Her name was Mieko. She had walked 30 ri through mountain and mist after setting fire to the room where she had once embroidered silks for a warlord's wife. We weren't prisoners, she said that night, voice steady, but we weren't free either. You understood. So did Sana. The forest grew quieter with 3, not because it feared you, but because it knew you were listening now. You started building a second shelter, not out of necessity, but ceremony. The act of raising walls together, of choosing where the windows faced, of placing charms above the door, it meant something. It turned survival into sanctuary. By the end of that week, a 4th woman came, then a 5th, one with a child, another with a limp. All of them came with silence in their eyes and stories folded into their ribs like paper knives. You didn't ask for explanations, only names and permission. Each woman left something behind at the shrine: a hair ribbon, a sliver of jade, a broken sandal, a dried bloom. And each learned in time to tend the fire, to recognize the owls that sang at dusk, to kneel in the moss and know that silence could be prayer. The forest no longer felt like a hiding place. It was a tapestry now, threaded with footsteps, smoke, song, and the laughter of women who had forgotten how to laugh. One night Mieko spoke to you by the fire. You were the first, but not the beginning. You nodded, because you knew what she meant. There had always been women like you, before the scrolls, before the laws, before the men wrote stories and forgot your names. Now you remembered them, and tomorrow when another arrived, you would make room again. Not out of pity, but because this place, this forest, this life had been carved with your own hands, and it belonged to those who chose to stay.
The summer ended the way summers always do in the forest. Not with a chill, but with stillness. The cicadas hushed. The bamboo didn't whisper. Even the river seemed to breathe more slowly, as if bracing for what came next. It was Miko who saw the smoke first. Not the kind from cooking fires, not the clean curl of pine wood burned with care. This was black, thick, coarse, climbing in a single column from the south ridge, too far from any village to be an accident. You gathered the women without raising alarm. They were already watching. Sana clutched her knife. The child, now walking, clung to Kiri's robes with wide, unblinking eyes. You didn't speak. You just moved. There were packs already prepared. It had become a ritual over time. Every new arrival was taught to pack and repack what they could carry in a single breathless minute. You had done the same. The shrine was last. You knelt and touched the earth, not to pray, but to listen. The forest didn't answer. That meant it was watching and waiting. You led the others away from the shelters, not along the river, not toward the old trail. Deeper, where the trees grew twisted and the stones sang at night. You knew the paths others didn't. Kiri had shown them to you, and you had walked them again and again, counting steps, touching bark, mapping the rhythm of the undergrowth. You followed no road, only memory. By dusk you'd reached the ravine, steep, jagged, hidden. There you waited and watched. The smoke didn't follow, but something else did. Footsteps, not loud, but deliberate. You saw them first. 3 men, robes like soldiers, swords at their waists, untouched. One of them bent, studying the old fire pit you'd left behind. Another held something in his hand. Your comb, the one they'd taken months ago, then discarded. He sniffed it, as if scent could lead him, as if memory left a trail. They didn't find you. Not that day, not that night. By dawn, they were gone. But the forest did not forget, and neither did you. The women asked what would come next. You didn't promise safety. You promised vigilance. That evening, you and Miko burned the old shelters, not in fear, but in offering. Let the smoke speak for you this time. Let it carry the story you'd rewritten, of women who weren't lost, but choosing, of names no longer whispered in shame, but spoken in strength. As the flames rose, Sana stood beside you, holding the new child. You watched the fire together, not with sorrow, but with resolve. Because the forest was still yours, and now it carried your smoke, your scent, your name. You didn't vanish. You became legend.
Autumn brought silence, not emptiness. It was a different kind of quiet now, earned,
not imposed. Leaves fell like folded prayers, and each one reminded you this was your life now. Not hiding, not waiting, living. Some nights you still dreamed of the town, of Hirotaka's house, its cold floors, the scrape of sandals on wood, the scent of miso left too long on the fire. You remembered your hands, how they trembled back then, how they never reached for what they wanted. You remembered not daring to speak because silence was safer. But that woman was a ghost now. One night you sat beneath the waning moon and wrote a letter. You had nothing to send it with, and no one to send it to. Still, you wrote. Not to Hirotaka. Not to your father or your sisters or the neighbors who never looked you in the eyes. You wrote to yourself. To the girl who had bowed so low her spine ached, to the bride who hadn't spoken on her wedding night, to the wife who scrubbed blood from the threshold and called it duty. You wrote, I see you. You are not weak for surviving. You are not shameful for leaving. And no matter what name the world gave your freedom, I will always call it sacred. You folded the parchment and tucked it beneath a stone near the shrine. Kitty watched from a distance but didn't interrupt. She understood what it meant to speak, even when no one else heard. The women kept building. Sana wove baskets from reeds that didn't crack in winter. Mieko trapped fish with such precision it felt like dance. The child, no longer a babe, ran barefoot over the stones, wild-haired, half laughing, half singing words only she understood. You taught her to climb trees. She taught you to forget fear. And still, the world turned. One evening, a hawk circled overhead and dropped something into the clearing. A strip of cloth, red, torn at the edge. You didn't pick it up. You didn't need to. Someone had found the ash of the shelters. Maybe they'd followed the scent. Maybe they simply guessed. But they knew now. You were still alive. You weren't afraid. Not anymore. The next morning, Kiri painted a symbol on the trunk of the oldest pine. A woman standing. Eyes wide. Mouth open. Hands held high, not in surrender, but in invocation. You all stood beneath it in silence. The sun rose through the mist. No one wept. No one prayed. You didn't need to. You had already become what they feared most. A woman they could not silence. A home they could not burn. A name they could not erase. And the wind? It never took your letter. Because some words were meant to stay rooted.
It was late winter when the storm came. Not a storm of wind or snow, but of steps. Distant at first, then nearer. Boots in mud. Men who didn't sing or shout or curse, just moved, steady, sure, as if they already knew where you'd be. You were gathering mushrooms with Mako when you heard it, the soft thump of disturbed soil, the hush of breath held too long, the crack of a twig that hadn't snapped on its own. You turned without panic. Mako had already vanished into the ferns. You didn't call her name. You knelt slowly and pressed your palm against the earth. Still warm, still alive, still yours. The forest listened as you moved. It softened your steps. It curled branches to block the view. It swallowed sound and reshaped it. Your protector now, not just your home. You reached the shrine in moments and saw them. 3 men, all in lacquered armor dulled by time and rain. Servants of someone too important to soil his own hands. Their faces were covered, but their stances betrayed them. Upright, superior, unafraid. They weren't looking for someone. They were looking for something. Evidence. Proof. A blade left behind. A charm too fresh. A bowl too full. Something to tell his lord that the shame he'd buried hadn't stayed buried. One of them picked up your old comb, turned it in his hand, laughed. The sound made the trees lean back. You stepped forward, no blade in hand, no anger on your face. Just presence, your presence. Enough to make him flinch when he saw you. He hadn't expected you to stand. You said nothing, but the forest did. The wind shifted. The hawk called. And from the mist came Kiri. Not running, not hiding, just walking, slow, deliberate, with the grace of someone who had nothing left to fear. Behind her, Sana, Mako, and 5 others you hadn't seen in weeks, all returning now, like roots reconnecting beneath the frost. The men backed away. They weren't fools. They had swords, yes, but you had something else. You had each other. They left, not in shame, but in silence, because they understood. This place was no longer one they could invade. It wasn't a village or a hiding place. It was a threshold, a boundary, a line drawn not in blood, but in choice. Later that night, you dug into the earth behind the shrine, and there in the roots of the oldest tree, you found it. The dagger you'd buried, still sharp, still waiting. You didn't take it out. You covered it again, because it was no longer your weapon. You were. And in the morning, the frost had begun to melt, not just on the trees, but on the hearts of the women who walked beside you. You were no longer wives, no longer exiles. You were the daughters of firelight and wind, the ones who stayed, the ones who would never be sent back. Spring came late, slow and sullen, as if the mountains themselves hesitated to let go of their grip on the snow. But with each passing week, the frost receded. Tiny shoots of green crept up from the forest floor. The birds returned, cautiously at first, their songs brittle like paper, as if testing the air for danger. You awoke each day before the sun, not because of fear, but because you had work to do. Real work, chosen work. You patched cloaks, planted roots, stitched together stories in thread and song. Mieko had taken to carving again, animal shapes mostly. Kitty taught you how to find salt fern near the creek bed. Even Sana, who rarely spoke, began humming again, her hands always busy braiding, bundling, building. The forest didn't just shelter you anymore. It fed you, taught you, carried you. But memory still crept in at dusk. Sometimes you thought of Hirotaka, not the face, but the weight, the years you spent shrinking, folding,
disappearing. It was like remembering a life someone else had worn. You didn't hate him. You didn't love him either. What you felt was stranger. Pity. He had never known what it was to be full. One night, as the frogs began their song, you returned to the shrine alone. The others had gone to gather firewood. You knelt beside the old pine and lit a small lantern, its glow pooling gold against the stones. And there, beside the root line, you unwrapped a scrap of parchment, not stolen, not given, but made. You had found ink the week before, berries mixed with soot and river water, and carved brush from reed. With a steady hand, you began to write. Not his name, yours. Your true name, the one you whispered in secret as a girl, the one you buried beneath house walls and silks and obedient silence, the one that still tasted of wind. It wasn't kanji, not quite. It was a shape, a mark, a vow. You pressed it into the bark behind the shrine, a signature, not of ownership, but of existence. I was here, it said. I chose this. When the others returned, they found you smiling, softly, not with joy, but with clarity, a calm that came from being seen by the trees, by the stars, by yourself. That night, as fire crackled and laughter flickered around the flame, you felt something shift. You were no longer hiding from your past. You were walking beside it, and it no longer led you backward. The past was not a chain anymore. It was a root, and roots, though buried, hold things upright. In the quiet that followed, you reached for Mieko's hand. She squeezed it once. No words, none needed. The forest whispered, and for the first time in years, you slept without dreaming. The rains came again, not like storms, but like sighs. Gentle and gray, they soaked the earth in silence. Leaves clung wet to the trees. Mist curled low to the ground. The forest became a watercolor, its edges blurred, its sounds distant. You didn't mind. The world had slowed, and you knew how to move within it now. The others did too. Mieko had begun teaching you to carve. Small things at first, a comb, a cup, but your fingers remembered the shape of stillness, of patience. Kiri was mapping the forest with stones and string. She said she was building a guide for girls yet to come. She'll need to know, she whispered one evening, tying knots between branches. She always comes. You asked who she meant, but Kiri only smiled, a smile older than her years, and kept walking. On the night of the new moon, you lit the lanterns. Each of you, 12 women, some scarred, some silent, all with soot-streaked hands and threadbare robes. No prayers were spoken, no gods invoked, just light, held gently in paper frames, floating upward through the branches. A ritual not from books, but from hunger, from survival, from the quiet belief that you had become something more than abandoned. You were untethered, and that was not the same as lost.
Mieko sang a song her grandmother once hummed. It was broken in places, but her voice held like woven silk. Tiri was mapping the forest with stones and string. She said she was building a guide for girls yet to come. "She'll need to know," she whispered one evening, tying knots between branches. "She always comes." You asked who she meant, but Kiri only smiled, a smile older than her years, and kept walking. On the night of the new moon, you lit the lanterns. Each of you, 12 women, some scarred, some silent, all with soot-streaked hands and threadbare robes. No prayers were spoken, no gods invoked, just light, held gently in paper frames, floating upward through the branches. A ritual not from books, but from hunger, from survival, from the quiet belief that you had become something more than abandoned. You were untethered, and that was not the same as lost. Mieko sang a song her grandmother once hummed. It was broken in places, but her voice held like woven silk. Seina danced barefoot around the lanterns. Even Yuki, who hadn't spoken since the winter, traced symbols in the air with her fingers. You watched. You listened. And for the first time in your life, you didn't wish to be anyone else. At dawn, when the mist burned off and the birds returned, a stranger stood at the edge of the grove. A woman. Thin, wrapped in a cloak too fine for the forest, her feet bare, her face pale with travel. She didn't speak, just bowed. Once, twice, then stepped back into the trees, disappearing like smoke. You didn't follow. You didn't need to. She had found the path. Someone always did. You thought then of your old life, of scrolls and slippers, of rice paper screens and closed doors, of Hirotaka's sighs, of waiting, of longing. It felt like a story someone had told you once by mistake. The woman you had been was gone, but not buried, transformed. You sat beneath the shrine and wrote again. This time not a name, but a question, a prayer, a promise. Then you folded the paper and tucked it beneath the roots, beside the comb and the carved fox Mieko had given you. You didn't need to know where the path led next, because for now, you were here, and that was enough.
That summer, the forest ripened, moss thickened on the stones, wildflowers pushed through cracks in the shrine's base. Bamboo leaves whispered even when there was no wind. The forest, once a place of hiding, had become something else, a body that breathed alongside yours. Women came and went. A new girl arrived with blood on her sleeves and rope burns on her wrists. She didn't speak for 5 days. When she finally did, her voice was rough as bark. Another, older, with gray streaks in her hair, walked into the grove like she had always belonged. Her name was Tomiko. She cooked without measuring, sang without shame, and laughed like a drumbeat. She became the one they called for when someone woke screaming. You still woke sometimes, not with fear, but with memory, of Hirotaka's voice in the next room, of footsteps in the snow, of women nodding silently as you passed, not out of respect, but because they recognized your mask. It was Mieko who said it first. "We should name this place." You all paused. Names had weight, but it felt right, not to mark it as yours, but to acknowledge that it existed, that it was real. You gathered around the old pine tree, the one split by lightning long ago, now grown tall despite it. A fire was lit, a bowl of water passed, and into it each of you dropped something small. A comb, a pine needle, a folded paper with a single word. Your turn came last. You pressed your fingers to your lips, then touched the water. "Ichi Onna," you whispered. "One woman." The name held. Not a place on a map, but a promise. A whisper passed through the trees. The next day, a boy wandered into the forest. Barefoot, dirty, maybe 10 years old. He didn't cry, just stood at the edge of the grove, staring at the lanterns strung between trees. Yuki approached him. She knelt, offered a rice ball, asked no questions. He stayed for a night, then another. By the third, he began to speak. He had no mother, no name he trusted, but he carried a piece of cloth embroidered with a spiral. You all saw it. No one spoke. You gave him a space by the fire, let him peel roots, stir porridge. He smiled once when Tomiko told him a story about a fox who stole shoes. That night, you dreamed again, but this time you weren't running. You stood still, at the edge of a clearing, a line of women behind you, a path ahead. The trees leaned in, not to trap you, but to bless. You took a step, and the forest opened, not with fear, but with welcome. You awoke before dawn and stepped outside. The mist clung to your sleeves, but you weren't cold. The shrine flickered gently in the light of a single lantern. You bowed to it, not as a servant, not as a wife, but as something new, not untethered, not lost, just becoming. And from somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. The forest had remembered your name and would carry it forward, into stories, into songs, into the mouths of girls yet to be born. You turned and walked back inside.
The rains came harder that autumn, heavier and longer than the years before. They drummed on the rooftops of Ichiona like war drums. Yet no one inside flinched. You'd learned how to line the walls with moss, how to weave straw thick enough to repel wind. You knew how to brace the door not from fear, but from habit. Because no storm would uproot what had taken root here. Still, on the 7th day of rain, something arrived with the wind. Not a man, not a hunter, a paper talisman. Torn, soaked, wrapped around a reed shaft and stuck between the split roots of the old pine tree. Kiri found it first. She didn't touch it, only stared. Tomiko was the one who unfolded it. She did so gently, with the tips of her fingers, as if peeling back something still alive. On it, a single word, painted in ink that bled like old wounds. Return. That night, no one sang. Even the children hushed. Because return was a word too sharp to touch.
a word spoken only in nightmares, a word left unspoken in all their stories. You sat by the fire and didn't speak, didn't move, until Mieko asked quietly, "Do you think it's him?" You didn't answer, because you already knew. Hirotaka was alive, and he had found your name. No one told you to go, but no one stopped you when you packed your cloak, slid the blade into your sleeve, and slipped into the night. The path to the edge of the forest had overgrown. It scratched your legs, tugged at your hair like a lover trying to hold you back. Still, you walked. You reached the crossroads by dawn. And there he was, Hirotaka. Older, thinner. His kimono no longer the crisp silk of the magistrate's house, but travel-worn. Dust-stained, dull. His beard had grayed, his sandals were cracked. But his eyes, those eyes had not changed. Still sharp, still cutting. He looked at you like a man counting. Like a man measuring what he'd lost against what he still believed he owned. "I came to bring you back," he said. Your fingers stayed at your side. "Back to what?" you asked. He said your name. The old one. The one you buried at the shrine years ago. You didn't flinch. You didn't correct him. You just listened. Listened as he spoke of duty, of appearances, of how he'd forgiven your disobedience. You almost laughed. But instead, you stepped forward. Slow. Deliberate. He reached for you and found your blade at his throat. His breath caught. You didn't press it in, just held it there and said, "I am not yours. I was never yours. I am not a wife. I am a woman." Then you turned and walked away. He didn't follow. Not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't chase what he no longer recognized. You returned to Ichiona before the stars appeared. They were waiting. No questions, no stories, just a bowl of hot rice, a warm mat, a child curled beside the fire with her hand wrapped around a fox-carved talisman. You took your place. The rain still fell. But inside, the wind carried nothing but peace. And in that hush, you realized the stories would go on. But this one was yours.
Winter didn't arrive all at once that year. It crept. Soft at first, like a breath on the back of your neck. Mist on early mornings. Frost on the outer stones. The forest held its breath as the chill deepened, and with each passing week the boundaries of Ichiona blurred. Trees leaned closer. Shadows lingered longer. Even the foxes watched in silence now, tails low, eyes knowing. Inside, the days shortened. The meals grew simpler. Roots, rice, wild greens dried from autumn. But hunger never ruled here.
because every bite was shared, and every bowl was offered with hands that remembered famine. You took to waking early, before the children stirred, before the embers of the night's fire fully died. You'd sit near the hearth, combing the ashes with a stick, listening. Because sometimes the fire spoke, not with words, but with crackles that felt like memory. One morning, the fire flared suddenly, bright, too bright. Tomiko rushed over. "Did you add oil?" You shook your head. The flames twisted, and in them, for just a breath, you saw a face. Not Hirotaka, yours. Not the woman you were now, the girl, red-eyed, kneeling, hair bound tight in shame. You blinked, and it was gone. The next night, Kiri brought you a wrapped cloth. Inside, your old comb. "The boy found it," she said, "near the eastern path." The teeth were cracked, but the shape held. You ran your thumb along the edge. The metal was cold, but it did not bite. That evening, the village gathered beneath the old pine. Not for warning, not for fear, but for telling. It had become a custom now, in the season's turn, to speak aloud the stories no one had dared utter before Ichiona. Each woman took a turn. Tomiko told of a lover who vanished after promising her a ring made from mountain snow. Mieko spoke of the time she walked into a lake hoping it would swallow her, and how the fish nibbled her ankles like children, refusing to let her sink. You didn't speak at first, but then your hands moved without asking. You drew a circle in the dirt, then another. Spiral. Slow. Deliberate. You said, "He didn't kill me." A pause. Then, "He just expected me to die." The wind held still. And then, breath from every throat. Not sorrow, not rage, but recognition. By the fire's end, the children had fallen asleep in laps. The elders dozed, and the rice pot bubbled gently, untouched. You stood, stepped back into the night. The forest was colder now, but no longer cruel. You turned toward the shrine, lit a candle, set the comb beside it, and whispered, "I remember." Not the pain, not the cage, but the leaving, the choosing, the rebuilding. And somewhere deep in the woods, a fox barked once, then twice, then silence. And you knew. The fire had remembered your story, and it would never forget.
You awoke before dawn. The forest outside was still, so still it felt like the world was paused between breaths. Your fire had burned low in the night, leaving only the faintest orange glow in the ashes, but you didn't stir to stoke it. You were listening. The silence held something, a hush filled not with fear, but with awareness, as if every leaf, every root, every patch of snow knew this was a day the story would change. You stepped outside without your shawl. The cold kissed your skin, sharp as a blade, but you welcomed it. Pain had once meant you were owned. Now it only meant you were alive. In the grove, the others were already gathering. Kiri, Mieko, the quiet ones with no names, and the fierce ones who'd named themselves again. They stood in a loose circle near the great cedar, barefooted, bare-handed, bearing no weapons and no fear. A trail of black feathers stretched from the shrine to the tree. A crow had died the night before, its body whole, its eyes unclouded. They said that was a sign, not of death, but of a message delivered. Kiri spoke first. There is something coming. No one asked what, because they felt it too. Not footsteps, not thunder, but return. The kind that happens not with one person, but with a reckoning. From the east, smoke began to rise. Thin at first, then thicker. Someone had lit a fire too early, too greedy. You knew the signs, soldiers or lordsmen or him. But there was no panic, only preparation. Not for battle, but for presence. You tied back your hair, not as a bride, but as a sentinel. You helped smear the ash across Kiri's cheeks. You sharpened sticks, not for killing, but for planting signs. You took your comb from the shrine, held it in your palm until it warmed to your skin, then placed it in the earth by the cedar roots. A seed, a warning, a declaration. When they arrived, it wasn't with horses and horns, but with hesitation. 3 men, cloaks rich with silk thread embroidery, but worn thin from travel. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten. They only asked, "Is she here?" You stepped forward. Not alone. Kiri flanked you on one side, Mieko the other, and behind them the silent forest of women who had once been erased. You said, "She isn't." One man blinked, but "She left," Kiri said. "Long ago," Mieko added. They glanced at one another, confused, cold. And for the first time in your life, you pitied them, because they didn't understand what had been born here, how something could die and yet become more alive than ever before, how women who disappeared could return as echoes that lingered forever. The men left, of course they did. And when they were gone, no one cheered. You simply turned, one by one, and returned to your lives. There was rice to boil, wood to stack, children to teach how to write their names in the dirt. And when the night came again, the fire blazed higher than it had in months. You sang, not loudly, not for anyone's ears, but the trees and the moon. And the forest listened, because now it knew your name, and it would carry it, on bark, on wind, on every silence that once hid your pain and now held your freedom forever.